The autumn of 1945 in Harwell, Tennessee arrived the way small American towns always did. Without asking permission and without apology, the storefronts stood intact along the main street, their windows unbroken, their signs freshly painted, the whole place moving through its morning with the unhurried certainty of somewhere that had never once learned to flinch. Sophie Wenzel sat in the back of the military truck and watched it pass through the gap in the canvas flap and said nothing, because there were no words in any language she knew for what it felt like to see a town that had not burned. The war had been over for 2 months. Long enough to stop waiting for the sound of aircraft. Long enough to recognize the guards by their walk and know which ones would nod and which ones would not. Long enough to understand, in the quiet and practical way that survival teaches, that the shooting was finished. What she did not yet understand was what it meant to be here, inside a country that looked like this, whole and unhurried and full of ordinary light, and what it would cost her to find out. The truck smelled of canvas and rust, and it had been moving for what felt like most of the morning. Sophie Wenzel sat with her back against the ribbed metal wall, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the wooden slats of the truck bed beneath her boots. She had learned early in the journey not to watch the road through the gap in the canvas flap. The landscape unsettled her in ways she could not name. Too open, too unbroken, too indifferent to everything that had happened across the water. There were 6 of them in the truck, for she barely knew. One she knew too well. Brunhild Kraus sat directly across from her, spine straight, arms crossed, watching the canvas flap with the focused stillness of someone cataloging information rather than experiencing it. She had not spoken since the transit camp outside Baltimore. That had been 2 days ago. Sophie had not pushed her. There was nothing to push toward. The truck slowed. A gear shifted with a grinding complaint, and the vehicle turned onto what sounded like a different kind of road, smoother, quieter under the tires. Through the canvas gap came a new smell. Not exhaust, not mud. Something else. Cut grass, perhaps, or the particular warmth of sun-baked stone. Then voices. Civilian voices, unhurried, not shouting. The truck stopped. A guard pulled back the canvas flap, and the light came in all at once, broad and clean and unwilling to be ignored. Sophie blinked. The other women stirred. Brunhild did not blink. She simply looked. They were on the edge of a small American town. It was the most ordinary thing Sophie had ever seen in her life, and for that reason it was the most disorienting. There were no ruins. There were no gaps in the rows of buildings where something had once stood and been taken down by fire or pressure or bad luck. The storefronts stood intact, their glass windows catching the midday light. A barber's pole turned slowly near the corner. A woman in a pale yellow dress walked along the sidewalk carrying a paper bag, and she did not look up as the military truck rolled past. She did not need to. Sophie stepped down from the truck bed and placed both feet on American soil for the first time. The ground was solid. That was the first thought she had. Not poetic, not searching, just that. The ground is solid here. Behind her, Brunhild dropped down without accepting the guard's offered hand. The street continued in both directions with the calm certainty of a place that had not once questioned its own survival. A hardware store. A post office with its flag hanging motionless in the still air. A church at the far end of the block, white-sided, its doors standing open as though it had nothing to protect and nothing to prove. A group of boys on bicycles pedaled past the far corner and disappeared behind a building. One of them was laughing at something the other had said, the sound trailing behind them like a thread pulled through a needle. Sophie stood still and let the town settle around her. One of the guards, a young man with sunburned forearms and a clipboard, moved along the row of women and spoke in measured, careful English, pausing after each instruction to allow the interpreter, a slight woman in civilian clothes who worked for the camp administration, to translate. Work assignments. Rules of movement. Check-in procedures. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone doing a job he had done before and expected to do again, without particular feeling in either direction. Brunhild leaned close to Sophie's ear. "Look at the windows," she said quietly. "Every shop is full. They are showing us the shelves on purpose." Sophie looked. The pharmacy window held a careful arrangement of bottles and tins. The general store beside it had canned goods stacked in the display, not in shortage formation, not rationed rows with gaps where things had run out, but in the careless abundance of a place where running out was not yet a concept that had arrived. I don't think they arranged that for us, Sophie said. Brunhild straightened. Then it's worse, she said. It means they don't even know what they have. The interpreter finished her translation. The guard lowered his clipboard and looked at the group with the brief, assessing glance of someone checking that all the pieces were accounted for. Then he nodded once toward the road ahead. They walked. The town did not stop for them. A man washing his car in a driveway paused, looked up, watched them pass, then returned to his work. A woman on a porch set down her glass and observed the small procession with an expression that Sophie could not entirely read. Not hostile, not warm, somewhere in the middle where reality usually lives. Near the end of the main street, a young soldier in uniform came out of a diner and nearly walked into the front of the group. He stepped back, steadied himself, and looked at the women with obvious surprise. Then something in his expression shifted. He removed his cap, not in greeting exactly, more the way a man removes his cap when entering a place he intends to respect. He stepped to the side and held the space open for them to pass. No one in the group spoke. They were led to a low building at the edge of town, a converted community hall, Sophie would later learn, that served as the administrative entry point for the work assignment camp a half-mile further down the road. Inside, there were chairs, a long table, more clipboard-holding administrators, and a smell of coffee so strong and real, it was almost aggressive. One of the other women whispered something behind Sophie. A short, involuntary sound of want. Brunhild sat down in the nearest chair and placed her hands on her knees. Tonight, she said quietly, to Sophie alone. Tell me everything you see. Everything. Not what you feel. What you see. Sophie sat beside her. And you will do the same? Yes. And then, Brunhild looked at the wall ahead of her. And then we will know what is real. Sophie said nothing more. She folded her hands and waited. Through the building's single side window, just visible past the edge of the frame, the church at the end of the street stood white and open-doored against the afternoon sky. Sophie watched it for a moment. The stillness of it, the way it seemed to require nothing from anyone passing by. She looked away before she could decide what it meant. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Not unfriendly. Assessing. Sophie, he said. Not a question. He had clearly been told. Yes, she said. Her English was careful, learned mostly from a grammar book and one winter of listening to a British radio signal that came through faintly on the eastern stations. I am Sophie Wenzel. Earl Whitfield. He did not extend his hand, not out of coldness, but out of the same practical efficiency with which he seemed to do everything. He simply moved to the counter and pointed to the space beside the bread woman. You'll work here today? Clara will show you the portions. Clara looked up, a woman in her mid-40s with kind, tired eyes and flour on her apron, and nodded once at Sophie with the undemanding welcome of someone too busy to perform hospitality, but genuine enough not to need to. Good morning, Clara said. Good morning, Sophie said. That was all. And then she was working. The bread came in large, dense loaves, and the portions were meant to fill a bag alongside the tins and dried goods that the other women packed. Clara demonstrated twice, then stepped aside. Sophie watched the thickness of the slice, the placement in the bag, the way Clara never wasted emotion. She began to cut. Her first portion was thin, the instinct of someone who had spent years in a world where bread was measured against absence, where giving too much meant leaving too little for whoever came next. Earl, passing behind her with the ledger under his arm, glanced at the slice without slowing. Give the full piece, he said. Don't decide for someone else what's enough. He continued to the next table. Sophie looked at the slice in her hand. Then she looked at the loaf. Then she cut again, a full, honest portion this time, the kind that did not apologize for itself. She put it in the bag. Clara said nothing, but she glanced at Sophie with the slight upward shift at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, the kind that meant, yes, that's right, you understood. By mid-morning, Sophie had found the rhythm of the kitchen. It was not complicated work, but it required attention. The right tin with the right bag, the correct count, the bags sealed and stacked in the order they would be distributed. There was a list. The list had names on it. Not categories, not numbers. Names. She paused over it once, just for a moment. Henderson, M. Family of 4. Alderman Street, Pruitt, G. Widow, elderly. No stairs, Kowalski, F. 3 children, husband overseas. She had not expected names. At midday, The kitchen slowed briefly while the women ate their own lunch at the long counter. A simple meal, soup and bread, the same food they were preparing for others. Earl sat at the end with his ledger closed beside him. He ate without ceremony and without hurry. Sophie ate standing near the sink, unsure whether the invitation to sit extended to her. Earl looked up. "There's a stool behind you." She turned. There was. She brought it to the counter and sat. For a while neither of them spoke. The other women talked quietly among themselves, something about a collection drive for the following Sunday, whether they had enough volunteers to cover the east side of the route. Then Earl said, without looking up from his soup, "We're in Germany." "Dresden," Sophie said. He nodded slowly. "The bombing," he said. It was not a question and not an accusation. It was simply an acknowledgement that he knew the word and what it meant. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry for that." She did not know what to do with those words. She had not been prepared for them. She had been prepared for distance, for suspicion, for the particular coldness of people who have decided in advance what you are. She had not been prepared for someone to say "I'm sorry for that" about Dresden, plainly, without qualification, across a bowl of soup in a church basement. She said, "Thank you." It felt insufficient. She knew it felt insufficient. But it was the truest thing she had available. Earl finished his soup and picked up his pencil again. In the afternoon, a group of women from the congregation arrived to help with the distribution run. Civilians who gave up their Thursday afternoons to carry bags across 2 neighborhoods and return with the empty ones. They were different ages, different shapes, and they talked over each other with the comfortable chaos of people who disagreed frequently and liked each other anyway. A debate broke out near the door about the best route to cover the Kowalski family street alongside the Henderson stops without backtracking. 3 women had 3 different opinions, and none of them were wrong. They argued for 4 minutes with genuine feeling and mild laughter, and then arrived at a solution that incorporated something from each position. No one was punished for disagreeing. No one was silenced. The decision was made, and then everyone picked up a bag and walked out the door. Sophie watched this from the counter. Earl appeared at her shoulder. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said. Then, because the word was not enough, they argued. "They always argue," Earl said. And then they agreed. "They always do that too." Sophie turned the thought over quietly. In the world she had come from, disagreement was not a step in a process. It was a fault line. It was the thing that, if visible, invited correction. To argue openly about the right way to do something, and then to do it, together, without anyone establishing who had been right, was a sequence she had no framework for. "It is strange," she said, "to argue without anyone losing." Earl looked at her for a long moment. "That's not strange," he said. "That's just how it's supposed to work." He moved back to his ledger. Sophie picked up the next bag on the stack and began to check its contents against the list. At the far end of town, in a building that smelled of motor oil, sawdust, and dry cardboard, Brunhild Kraus was counting. The depot was larger than she had expected. The main floor was a converted factory space. High ceilings, concrete floor, long rows of metal shelving that stretched from the loading dock at the back to the administrative offices at the front. The shelving was full. Not carefully full, not arranged for display. Full in the way that a working storage space is full, with the comfortable disorder of a place that has more than it needs and knows it. Brunhild had been assigned to inventory verification, walking a section of shelving with a checklist, confirming that the items on the list matched the items on the shelf, marking discrepancies. It was precise work. She was good at it. She was also very good at noticing things that were not on the checklist. The goods on the shelves were not military supplies, or not only military supplies. There were canned vegetables, flour sacks, cooking oil, soap, blankets still in their paper wrapping, bolts of fabric, medicine tins, children's shoes in various sizes. These were civilian goods, relief goods, items destined not for soldiers, but for the surrounding community. The families on the list she did not know about, the Hendersons and the Pruitts and the Kowalskis. She moved down the row slowly, checking her list, saying nothing. At the end of the aisle, a heavy-set American worker named Douglas was restacking a fallen pile of flour sacks with the particular expression of a man who was mildly irritated but too experienced to be truly upset. He noticed Brunhild watching. "Slipped," he said, by way of explanation, patting the restored stack. Brunhild looked at the sacks. 20-pound bags, stacked 6 high, 3 rows deep. More flour than her entire street in Hamburg had seen in 2 years. All of this, she said carefully, in her careful English. It goes to the town? Some of it. Douglas wiped his hands on his trousers. Some goes further out. Families in the county. Church organizations. There's a list. Who makes the list? He looked at her with mild curiosity at the question. The church ladies, mostly. The relief committee. They figure out who needs what. He shrugged. We just move the boxes. Brunhild looked at the shelves for another moment. Then she returned to her checklist and continued down the row. She marked everything correctly. She said nothing further to Douglas. But at the end of the afternoon, before the truck came to return the workers to camp, she walked the length of the main floor one more time, slowly, unhurried, as if checking something she had missed. She was not checking anything she had missed. She was looking, taking the full measure of what was here, in this ordinary building, in this ordinary town, that had apparently always been here and expected nothing remarkable about itself. The shelves did not know they were being observed. That was what bothered her most. That evening, in the low wooden building at the camp that served as the women's common room, Sophie and Brunhild sat across from each other at a table near the window. The other women had gone to their bunks early. Outside, the last of the day's light sat on the horizon like something that hadn't decided yet whether to leave. Tell me, Brunhild said. Sophie told her. The kitchen, the names on the list, the argument that ended in agreement, the women who gave their afternoons to carry bags for. She did not editorialize. She reported, as Brunhild had asked. Brunhild listened without interrupting. When Sophie finished, she said, and the old man. Earl. He corrected my bread portions, Sophie said. He told me to give the full piece and not decide for someone else what's enough. Brunhild was quiet for a moment. What else did he say? He asked where I was from. When I said Dresden, he said he was sorry for the bombing. Something moved across Brunhild's face, brief, contained, quickly replaced. He said that. Yes. Just like that. Just like that. Brunhild straightened and crossed her arms. It's a calculated gesture. They know how to disarm people. Maybe, Sophie said. He didn't say it as a gesture. He said it the way you say something because it's true and it needs to be said. The goods on the shelves were not military supplies. Or not only military supplies. There were canned vegetables, flour sacks, cooking oil, soap, blankets still in their paper wrapping, bolts of fabric, medicine tins, children's shoes in various sizes. These were civilian goods. Relief goods. Items destined not for soldiers, but for the surrounding community. The families on the list she did not know about, the Hendersons and the Pruitts and the Kowalskis. She moved down the row slowly, checking her list, saying nothing. At the end of the aisle, a heavy-set American worker named Douglas was restacking a fallen pile of flour sacks with the particular expression of a man who was mildly irritated but too experienced to be truly upset. He noticed Brunhild watching. Slipped, he said, by way of explanation, patting the restored stack. Brunhild looked at the sacks. 20-pound bags, stacked 6 high, 3 rows deep. More flour than her entire street in Hamburg had seen in 2 years. All of this, she said carefully, in her careful English. It goes to the town? Some of it. Douglas wiped his hands on his trousers. Some goes further out. Families in the county. Church organizations. There's a list. Who makes the list? He looked at her with mild curiosity at the question. The church ladies, mostly. The relief committee. They figure out who needs what. He shrugged. We just move the boxes. Brunhild looked at the shelves for another moment. Then she returned to her checklist and continued down the row. She marked everything correctly. She said nothing further to Douglas. But at the end of the afternoon, before the truck came to return the workers to camp, she walked the length of the main floor one more time, slowly, unhurried, as if checking something she had missed. She was not checking anything she had missed. She was looking, taking the full measure of what was here, in this ordinary building, in this ordinary town, that had apparently always been here and expected nothing remarkable about itself. The shelves did not know they were being observed. That was what bothered her most. That evening, in the low wooden building at the camp that served as the women's common room, Sophie and Brunhild sat across from each other at a table near the window. The other women had gone to their bunks early. Outside, The last of the day's light sat on the horizon like something that hadn't decided yet whether to leave. "Tell me," Brunhild said. Sophie told her. The kitchen, the names on the list, the argument that ended in agreement, the women who gave their afternoons to carry bags for strangers. She did not editorialize. She reported, as Brunhild had asked. Brunhild listened without interrupting. When Sophie finished, she said, "And the old man. Earl. He corrected my bread portions," Sophie said. "He told me to give the full piece and not decide for someone else what's enough." Brunhild was quiet for a moment. "What else did he say?" "He asked where I was from. When I said Dresden, he said he was sorry for the bombing." Something moved across Brunhild's face, brief, contained, quickly replaced. "He said that?" "Yes. Just like that. Just like that." Brunhild straightened and crossed her arms. "It's a calculated gesture. They know how to disarm people." "Maybe," Sophie said. "He didn't say it as a gesture. He said it the way you say something because it's true and it needs to be said. You can't know that after one day." "No," Sophie agreed. "I can't." Brunhild looked out the window. "The depot is full," she said after a pause. "Not army supplies. Civilian goods. Flour, medicine, shoes for children. All of it organized by a committee of women from the churches." Sophie waited. "It isn't arranged for us to see," Brunhild said, and her voice had a quality Sophie had not heard before. Not concession exactly, but the particular flatness of someone removing an argument they no longer fully believe. "The workers don't think about it. It is simply how the place operates." "What does that mean to you?" Sophie asked. Brunhild turned back from the window. "I don't know yet," she said. "Don't ask me what it means yet." Sophie nodded. "All right. Tell me about the old man tomorrow. After you've seen him again." "I will." Brunhild pulled her coat tighter and looked at the wall. Outside, a cricket began its steady, indifferent song in the grass. Somewhere further, a car passed on the main road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of the common room before vanishing. Sophie did not say, "I think he lost a son in the war." She had heard it mentioned in passing by Clara during the afternoon, a quiet half-sentence not meant to be carried further. She would save it for when it mattered. She was learning, slowly, that timing was everything in a place like this. Not strategy, just patience. The kind of patience Earl had when he handed someone a full piece of bread and trusted them to understand why. "You can't know that after one day." "No," Sophie agreed. "I can't." Brunhild looked out the window. "The depot is full," she said after a pause. "Not army supplies. Civilian goods. Flour, medicine, shoes for children. All of it organized by a committee of women from the churches." Sophie waited. "It isn't arranged for us to see," Brunhild said, and her voice had a quality Sophie had not heard before. Not concession exactly, but the particular flatness of someone removing an argument they no longer fully believe. "The workers don't think about it. It is simply how the place operates." "What does that mean to you?" Sophie asked. Brunhild turned back from the window. "I don't know yet," she said. "Don't ask me what it means yet." Sophie nodded. "All right. Tell me about the old man tomorrow. After you've seen him again." "I will." Brunhild pulled her coat tighter and looked at the wall. Outside, a cricket began its steady, indifferent song in the grass. Somewhere further, a car passed on the main road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of the common room before vanishing. Sophie did not say, "I think he lost a son in the war." She had heard it mentioned in passing by Clara during the afternoon, a quiet half-sentence not meant to be carried further. She would save it for when it mattered. She was learning, slowly, that timing was everything in a place like this. Not strategy, just patience. The kind of patience Earl had when he handed someone a full piece of bread and trusted them to understand why. The second week settled into rhythm the way rivers settle after rain. Not calm exactly, but purposeful, moving in a direction that had stopped being surprising. Sophie arrived at the church kitchen each morning at 7 and left each afternoon when the last bag had been checked and the counters wiped down. She had learned the names of the 3 regular women by the end of the first week. Clara, who sliced bread and spoke in short sentences that contained more than they appeared to. Margaret, who was 62 and had the organizational authority of someone who had been running things quietly for decades without requiring acknowledgement. And Ruth, the youngest of the 3, perhaps 30, whose husband was still somewhere in the Pacific and who never mentioned it except once, sideways. when she thought no one was listening. Sophie listened. She did not let on that she had heard. Earl moved through the kitchen the way a current moves through water, present everywhere, loud nowhere. He checked the ledger each morning, spoke to each woman briefly, solved small problems before they became large ones, and spent the rest of his time doing whatever needed doing without assigning it a name. He had fixed a dripping pipe under the sink on Tuesday using a wrench he kept in a canvas bag near the door. He had reordered a supply delivery on Wednesday with 2 sentences to a man on the telephone. He had on Thursday morning stood quietly at the kitchen entrance for several minutes before anyone else arrived, looking out at the street, his coffee cooling in his hand, before turning back inside without a word about whatever he had been thinking. He was not easy to know, but he was not difficult either. He was simply a man who had decided long ago what mattered and had organized his life accordingly, and who saw no reason to explain that decision to anyone. On Friday of the second week, he placed the ledger on the counter in front of Sophie. She looked up from the bag she was sealing. "Read it if you want," he said. "Don't have to. But it answers a question you've been holding since Monday." He moved away to the stove before she could ask how he had known. She opened the ledger. It was a simple bound notebook, the kind with a cloth cover and numbered pages. The entries were in several different handwritings, some neat, some hasty, recorded over what appeared to be the past 3 years. Each entry listed a date, a name or family name, a street address, and beside it a column of figures: what had been donated, what had been distributed, what remained. She turned pages slowly. The names came from everywhere. German names, Polish names, Italian names, Irish names, names she could not place at all. The amounts varied widely. Some entries recorded large donations, others recorded $2 and a half pound of coffee, a tin of sardines, a pair of boots, size 7. One entry, in Ruth's handwriting, recorded simply, "Anonymous, left at the side door, Tuesday morning. 3 blankets, 1 bag cornmeal." No name. No acknowledgement required. Left at the side door and noted in the ledger not to assign credit, but simply to account for what had arrived and where it had gone. Sophie turned to the most recent entries. She found families she recognized from the distribution list: Henderson, Pruitt, Kowalski. Beside each name, a record of what had come to them and when. Not charity in the sense of distance, not the impersonal distribution of surplus, but a careful, sustained attention to specific people in specific circumstances, maintained week after week by women who had other things to do and chose this anyway. She closed the ledger carefully and set it back where Earl had placed it. When he came past again, she said, "How long has this kitchen been running?" "Since 42, he said. 3 years. Going on 4. She looked at the ledger. The same families every week. Some move on, get back on their feet. New ones come in. He picked up the ledger and tucked it under his arm. The list changes. The work doesn't. "Why do they give?" she asked. "Some of the amounts in there. It is not people who have much to spare." Earl thought about this for a moment in the way he thought about things, genuinely, without performing the thinking. "Because having little doesn't mean you have nothing to offer," he said. "Most people understand that. They just need somewhere to bring it." He moved on to the stove. Sophie stood at the counter with the sealed bag in her hand and the weight of that sentence settling into her the way sentences do when they are not trying to teach you anything, but happen to be exactly true. In the early afternoon, a soldier came in off the street. He was young, mid-20s at most, in a uniform that was clean but carried the particular looseness of someone recently returned from somewhere that had left a mark. He took off his cap when he came through the basement door and held it against his chest with both hands. He looked around the kitchen briefly, found what he was looking for, an empty chair near the far wall, and sat down. He did not ask for anything. Margaret looked up, looked at him, and ladled soup into a bowl without a word. She set it in front of him with a piece of bread beside it and returned to her counter. Clara dried her hands on her apron and walked over to him. She placed one hand briefly on his shoulder, not heavily, not with drama, just present, just there, and said, "Welcome back, Thomas." "Thank you, Mrs. Clara," the soldier said. He bowed his head before he ate. Not quickly, not for show. He sat with his head bowed for a full, unhurried moment and then lifted his fork. Sophie watched from across the kitchen. Ruth appeared at Sophie's shoulder, speaking quietly. "He was in the Pacific. Came back 2 weeks ago. Comes in every Friday." She paused. "He doesn't say much." But he keeps coming. Sophie looked at the young soldier eating his soup in the corner, his cap folded neatly on the table beside his bowl. He did not look triumphant. He did not look like a man who had won anything. He looked like someone carrying something heavy that he was learning, slowly, how to set down. She thought about what she had been taught. That American soldiers were loud, arrogant, drunk on their own power. That they moved through the world with the entitlement of people who believed everything was theirs already. She had been given that picture in such complete detail that she had never thought to question its edges. The soldier in the corner finished his soup. He left the bowl clean. He folded his napkin. He stood, put his cap back on, and stopped to say something to Earl near the door. Something short, spoken quietly, that made Earl nod once with the particular gravity of men who understand each other without requiring many words. Then he left. Sophie turned back to her work. She did not say anything about it to anyone. She stored it in the same careful place she was storing everything else. Not yet conclusions, not yet evidence, just the accumulating weight of things that did not fit the picture she had arrived with. That afternoon, before the end of her shift, Earl found her restacking empty crates near the supply shelf. "You're good at this work," he said. He did not make it into more than it was. It was a plain observation about a plain thing. "Thank you," she said. He picked up one of the crates and stacked it with the others. For a moment, they worked side by side in the easy silence of people who have spent enough time in the same room to stop needing to fill it. Then Sophie said, "The soldier who came in today? Thomas." "Yes." He prayed before he ate. Earl set down the last crate. "He does." It did not seem like a performance. "It isn't." She considered this. "We were told that Americans have no real faith. That religion here is decoration. Something people wear on Sundays and forget by Monday." Earl looked at her with the measured steadiness he brought to every difficult thing. He did not seem offended. He seemed, if anything, mildly interested in the accuracy of what he was about to say. "Some people, sure," he said. "Same as anywhere. But for a lot of folks here, faith is the thing that holds the rest of it up. The kitchen, the ledger, the Thursday volunteers." He paused. "It doesn't start with a list of people who need soup. It starts with believing those people matter." Sophie said nothing for a moment. "In the place I came from," she said carefully, "we were told that what held things up was something else entirely." Earl did not ask what. He seemed to know, in the broad, quiet way of someone who had lived through one war and watched another one happen to his children's generation, that she did not need to name it. "How did that work out?" he asked. The question was not cruel. It was not a point scored. It was asked with the same plainness he applied to everything, and it landed the way plain questions do, without armor, directly against the place where the answer lived. Sophie picked up her coat from the hook near the door. "Not well," she said. Earl nodded once. "No," he said. "I didn't think so." At the depot, the second week had given Brunhild something she had not anticipated: boredom. The work was repetitive enough that her mind ran parallel to it, her hands moving down the inventory rows, checking boxes against the list, while her thoughts moved through the observations she had accumulated and turned them over looking for the catch. There was always a catch. Systems did not sustain themselves on goodwill. Goodwill was a veneer, and beneath every veneer was the structure that actually held things in place. Interest, leverage, the careful management of appearances. She had been looking for the structure beneath this one. She had not found it yet. Douglas had said something on Wednesday that stayed with her. She had asked, carefully, who funded the relief supplies, who paid for the flour and the medicine and the children's shoes stacked in their paper wrapping on the long metal shelves. He had scratched his neck and thought about it and said, government some, churches some, regular folks some. People just bring things in. They drop off whatever they've got extra. He had shrugged. It adds up. It adds up. As though the mechanism were obvious. As though the consistent, sustained generosity of a community toward its struggling members were simply arithmetic. She had marked it down in the ledger of things she did not yet have an explanation for. On Friday afternoon, the truck that would return the depot workers to camp was late. Brunhild was given no instruction except to wait near the loading dock. She had been standing there for 20 minutes when she became aware that something was happening further along the street. She could not see it directly from the dock, but she could hear it. Voices, more than one, followed by a sound she identified after a moment as singing. Not performance singing. The kind of singing that happens when people who know a song well choose to sing it together without an audience. She walked to the corner of the building. On the steps of a small chapel across the street, a group of perhaps a dozen people had gathered after what appeared to be a late afternoon service. They were not all the same age. There were older men and women, a few younger ones, a child or two standing beside adults. They were not dressed formally. They had the look of people who had come directly from wherever their week had taken them. A man near the door said something Brunhild could not hear clearly over the distance. Then the group bowed their heads. Brunhild stood at the corner of the building and watched. The prayer lasted longer than she expected. It was not the brief, efficient prayer of ceremony. It had the quality of something real being said to someone the speakers believed was genuinely listening. The words came to her in fragments. The distance and the ambient noise of the street swallowed most of it, but she caught phrases. Those who are far from home. Those who suffer. Those on the other side of this war. The man leading it paused between the phrases, and the pauses were not empty. They were full, in the way that silences are full when the people holding them mean what surrounds them. Those on the other side of this war. Brunhild stood very still. She had expected American religion to be what German propaganda had described. A prop, a cultural habit, a tool for maintaining social order and national mythology. She had expected, at most, prayers for American soldiers, American victory, American families. The grammar of those prayers was familiar. She had heard its equivalent before, in different buildings, with different words, pointing inward toward the nation and its own. This was pointing outward, toward the other side. She stood at the corner of the building for a long time. The group on the chapel steps finished their prayer and broke apart slowly, exchanging words, moving off in different directions down the street. The child took an adult's hand, and they walked away together. The man who had led the prayer held the door for the last few people, and then stood alone on the steps for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, before going back inside. The street returned to its ordinary noise. Brunhild walked back to the loading dock and sat down on a crate. She did not take out her checklist. She did not review her inventory notes. She sat with her hands on her knees and looked at the floor of the dock and did not think in the organized, cataloging way she usually thought. She simply sat. The truck arrived 8 minutes later. She got on without speaking to anyone. That evening at the common room table, it was Sophie who spoke first. She told Brunhild about the ledger, the 3 years of names and amounts, the anonymous blankets left at the side door, the sustained and specific attention to people who were not family, not neighbors in any tribal sense, simply people in the same town who needed something. She told her about Thomas, the soldier in the corner with his cap folded on the table and his head bowed before his soup. She told her what Earl had said about faith being the thing that held the rest of it up. Brunhild listened. She was quieter than usual. Not the pointed quiet of someone waiting to argue, but a different kind. The quiet of someone who has used up a particular resource and has not yet found its replacement. Your turn, Sophie said. Brunhild looked at the table. She told Sophie about the depot shelves. She described the flour sacks and the children's shoes with the same flat precision she applied to inventory. She told her what Douglas had said. It adds up, and the way he had shrugged as though the whole mechanism were simply obvious. Then she stopped. Sophie waited. There is something else, Sophie said. Not a question. Brunhild was quiet for another moment. There was a prayer, she said finally. Outside a chapel. I heard part of it. What did they pray for? Brunhild looked up. Her eyes were steady, not wet, not broken open, but carrying something new inside them, something that had not been there this morning. For people on the other side of the war, she said. Those were the words. The other side. Sophie said nothing. It could be theater, Brunhild said. But her voice, for the first time since the truck had rolled through this town, did not fully carry the argument it was transporting. The words arrived without the structure that usually held them upright. Sophie looked at her. Could be, she said simply. Brunhild pressed her lips together. Don't agree with me just to be kind. I'm not, Sophie said. I'm agreeing with you because I don't know either. But I know what theater looks like. Theater knows when it has an audience. She paused. You were at the corner of a building. They could not see you. Brunhild had no response to this. She looked at the window for a long time. Outside, the evening had settled fully over the camp, and the lights from the main building cast a long yellow rectangle across the grass. Tell me about the old man again, she said, at last. Which part? The part about having little, Brunhild said. What he said about having little. Sophie folded her hands on the table. Having little doesn't mean you have nothing to offer, she said. And then he said most people understand that. They just need somewhere to bring it. Brunhild was quiet for a long time after that. She did not call it theater again that night. The third week began with rain. It came in overnight and was still falling by morning. Not a violent rain, not the kind that announces itself, but the steady, patient kind that settles into the ground and stays. The streets darkened. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. The trucks that carried the workers to their assignments ran with their headlights on even at 7 in the morning, and the women climbed in with their collars up and their shoulders drawn inward against the damp. Sophie sat across from Brunhild on the ride into town. Neither of them spoke much. That had changed between them over the past 2 weeks, not the friction, which was still there, still real, but its quality. It had become less like collision and more like tension in a rope that two people are both holding, each pulling just enough to keep it taut, neither willing to let go. At the fork in the road, Brunhild stepped down from the truck without her usual remark. She pulled her collar up and looked at Sophie for a moment through the rain. "The old man," she said. "Ask him something real today." "What do you mean, real?" "Something that costs him something to answer," Brunhild said. "You've had 2 weeks of work instructions and plain philosophy. Ask him something that goes deeper than that." The truck idled. The rain ticked against the canvas. "And if he doesn't answer?" Sophie said. "Then that is also information," Brunhild said. She turned and walked toward the depot without looking back. The kitchen was warm against the gray morning. Clara had the stoves going early, and the smell of coffee and something baking reached Sophie at the basement door before she was fully inside. She hung her wet coat on the hook and moved to her station, and the day began with the quiet efficiency that had by now become familiar. The portioning, the sealing, the checking of the list. Earl arrived at 7:15, later than usual. He came in without explanation, shook the rain from his hat, set it on the shelf above the door, and went directly to his ledger. His face carried something, not visible in any particular feature, but in the way a room carries the presence of weather before the weather arrives. Sophie noticed it and said nothing. By mid-morning the rain had eased to a drizzle, and the Thursday volunteers had come and gone with their bags. The kitchen was in the slow, post-distribution lull, counters cleaned, pots soaking, the next preparation not yet begun. Clara and Margaret had gone upstairs to the main hall for something. Ruth was in the small office at the back of the basement, on the telephone. Earl stood at the far counter with his coffee, looking at a point somewhere between the cup and the wall. Sophie carried 2 empty crates to the supply shelf near him, set them down, and remained. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked up. "Go ahead." She had turned Brunhild's instruction over all morning. Something that costs him something to answer. And she had arrived at the only question that had been sitting beneath all the others since the first day. "You lost someone," she said. "In this war." It was not quite a question. Earl looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully categorize. Not guarded, not pained, something more composed than either, the expression of a man who has visited a hard truth enough times that he no longer flinches at its door. "My son," he said. "Robert." He was 24. The Pacific. 1943. "I'm sorry," Sophie said. He nodded, the same nod he had given her when she said it about Dresden. Brief, genuine, not requiring more from either side. She held the next question carefully before she asked it. "Does it change how you see us? Being here, doing this work, does it change how you see the women you are working with?" Earl set his coffee down. He looked at the counter for a moment in the way he looked at things he was thinking about honestly. "I'd be lying if I said it doesn't sometimes," he said. "There are mornings." He paused. "But Robert didn't die so that I could spend the rest of my life deciding who deserves a bowl of soup and who doesn't." He picked up his coffee again. That's not what he was fighting for, and I think he'd have said so himself. Sophie was quiet for a moment. "How do you know what he would have said?" Earl looked at her directly. "Because I knew him," he said. "He was a kind boy. Stubborn, a little too sure of himself sometimes, but kind. He would have sat down with anyone." He paused again. He did, actually. His letters home were full of people, not just Americans. He wrote about a French farmer who gave him bread. He wrote about a German family he saw walking on a road in Italy, carrying what was left of their things. He said they looked the same as anyone who'd lost everything. Earl's voice did not waver. It carried the weight of those words the way old timber carries weight. not by being rigid but by having been shaped by a long time. He didn't hate easily, he said. I try to honor that. Sophie said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, I was a schoolteacher. Before all of this, I taught history to children. Earl looked at her with the patient attention he gave to things that mattered. What did you teach them, he asked. What I was given to teach, she said. I told myself there was a difference between writing the lesson and delivering it. She stopped. The sentence had arrived at a place she had not intended to take it, or perhaps had intended all along, moving toward it since the day she had read the ledger and felt the first clean fracture in the structure of what she had always told herself. I'm not sure there was as much difference as I believed. Earl was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Probably not. He did not say it harshly. He said it the way you say something true that the other person already knows, confirming it not to hurt, but because confirmation is its own form of respect. But you're here now, asking the question. That counts for something. Does it? In my experience, Earl said, the people who never ask the question are the ones you can't do anything with. The ones who ask it, even late, even when it's uncomfortable, those are the ones something can still be built with. He picked up the ledger and moved to the next task. Sophie stood at the supply shelf for a moment with her hands loose at her sides. The rain had stopped. Through the small basement window, a thin bar of pale light lay across the floor, tentative, uncertain of itself, but present. Across town, Brunhild was not at the depot. The morning's rain had delayed a large incoming delivery, and the supervisor had sent half the workforce to a secondary task, helping to reorganize a storage annex on the far side of the depot grounds, a low building used for overflow that had accumulated several weeks of unsorted donations. It was in this building that Brunhild spent most of the morning, working alongside two American civilian workers, a woman named Patricia, who was 50 and efficient, and a man named George, who was 60-something and moved with the deliberate care of someone whose back had an opinion about everything he asked it to do. The annex was a different kind of full than the main depot floor. Where the shelves in the main building had the organized abundance of a working system, the annex had the textured, human fullness of things that had been gathered by hand. Coats hung on a rod along one wall. Adult coats, children's coats, some worn smooth at the elbows, some nearly new. Shoes were sorted in pairs and placed in rows on a low shelf. Books were stacked in careful columns beside them, their spines showing a range of subjects, fiction and practical guides, and a children's picture book with a blue cover worn pale at the corners. Brunhild worked steadily, sorting and recording. She did not speak much. Patricia hummed occasionally as she worked, breaking off when she needed to concentrate on a label and picking up again a few bars later. George made occasional dry observations about the state of the annex that were directed at no one in particular and were mildly funny in the way things are funny when they are simply accurate. At mid-morning, two women arrived from one of the local churches, not women Brunhild had seen before, younger than Clara and Margaret, carrying more boxes between them. They set the boxes on the sorting table with the satisfied effort of people completing something they had started elsewhere, and one of them turned to Patricia. The Hendersons took the last of the winter coats, she said. I put a note in the book. We'll need more before November. I'll put it on the Sunday list, Patricia said without looking up from her clipboard. The church woman nodded, and then her eyes moved to Brunhild. A brief, assessing glance, not unfriendly, carrying the slight recalibration of someone who had not expected to find a German woman in the annex this morning. She said, without particular ceremony, "Morning." "Good morning," Brunhild said. The woman held her gaze for a moment, then nodded, the same small nod Brunhild had seen from the soldier outside the administrative building on the first day, from Douglas at the depot, from the guard at the camp gate. Not performance, simply acknowledgement. The two women left. Brunhild returned to her sorting. She worked through the morning without arriving at any particular conclusion. She had stopped trying to arrive at conclusions. The effort of constructing interpretations that held together had become increasingly expensive, and the materials available for it were diminishing. The things she was seeing were not hidden. They were not staged. They were simply what this place was, the slow, sustained, unremarkable effort of a community moving toward its struggling members the way water moves toward low ground. Not dramatically, just because that is the direction things go. In the afternoon, the rain returned briefly and then stopped for good. The light that followed was the particular gold of a wet day clearing, thick and honest, making everything it touched briefly vivid. Brunhild was sent back to the main depot floor to complete her morning inventory. She moved through the familiar rows with her checklist, marking items, turning at the end of each aisle for the next. At the far end of the building, the loading dock doors had been rolled open to let in the clearing air, and through them she could see the street. The chapel was visible from the dock. It was the same chapel she had seen from the corner of the building the previous week, small, white, with a wooden sign above the door that she had never been close enough to read. It stood across and slightly down the street, its front steps still damp from the morning rain. As she reached the end of her last inventory row, she became aware that something was happening on those steps. People were gathering, not in the large, organized way of a scheduled service, in the gradual, arriving way of people responding to something that had already begun. She counted perhaps 20, perhaps 25, spread across the steps and the small path in front of the building. She could hear singing from here, the same kind she had heard the week before, voices together without amplification, carrying across the wet air with the particular clarity that comes after rain. She stood at the open dock doors. She could not leave the building without permission. That was the rule, and she had no inclination to break it. But she could stand here, and she could see, and she could hear, and no rule prevented that. The group on the steps was mixed, ages, men and women, a few young people alongside the older ones. A man near the door appeared to be leading the singing, or simply to have started it, and allowed it to grow around him. The song was one Brunhild did not recognize, but its shape was familiar in the way that the shapes of hymns are familiar across languages. The rise towards something, and the return, the gathering of voices into a single direction. The singing stopped. The man near the door bowed his head. The others followed. Brunhild watched. The prayer was longer this time, or perhaps she was simply more present to it than she had been at the corner of the building the previous week. The man's voice carried, though she could only hear fragments. The words were plain. He was not constructing an argument or a declaration. He was speaking to someone he believed could hear him, about things that mattered to the people standing with him. He prayed for the men still overseas. He prayed for the families waiting at home. He prayed for the city of Hiroshima, which Brunhild understood from the word alone, from the way the man said it slowly, as though it carried weight that needed to be distributed carefully across the air. And then he said, "Lord, have mercy on those who were our enemies, and on those who still carry the wounds of what was done in this war, on all sides. Let the children who come after us not inherit the hatred we were handed. Let them start from something better than we did." The group was silent. Brunhild stood at the loading dock with her checklist loose in her hand and did not move. She had expected, again, what she had always been given. Faith as a flag, prayer as a claim, God invoked in the grammar of ours and theirs, the divine recruited to stand on one side of a line and confirm it. That was the only version she had ever seen. That was the version she had grown up inside. This was not that. This was a group of American civilians, in a small town, in the clearing light of a wet afternoon, asking their God to have mercy on their enemies. Not grudgingly, not as a performance of virtue, not with the self-congratulatory quality of people who know they are being watched, with the plain, undecorated sincerity of people who believed it. The woman who had stood at the back of the group near the steps looked up as the prayer ended and turned, by chance, in the direction of the loading dock. She was perhaps 40, with a plain coat and her hair pulled back. She could not have seen clearly from that distance. Brunhild was in the shadow of the dock doorway, but she paused for a moment, and then she lifted her hand in a brief, unhurried wave, as though simply acknowledging that someone was there. Brunhild did not wave back. Her hand did not lift. She stood completely still. The woman lowered her hand, turned back to the group, and moved with them as they dispersed. Brunhild stood at the dock doors for a long time after they had gone. Behind her, Douglas set down a crate with a hollow knock on the concrete floor. George said something to Patricia in the annex. Outside, a car passed on the street and moved on. The world continued in its ordinary motion, unconcerned with what had just happened in one woman standing in a doorway. She walked back to her shelf and picked up the last page of her checklist. Her handwriting, when she resumed marking the inventory, was slightly different than it had been in the morning. Not illegible, careful, even, but slower, as though something in the mechanism of it had altered by a fraction that couldn't be named, but would from now on be present. That evening, the rain was entirely gone, and the sky above the camp was clear and very large and full of stars in the way that skies are only full of stars in places that have no reason to light themselves up. Sophie arrived at the common room table first. She sat and waited. Brunhild came in later than usual. She sat down across from Sophie and placed her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Sophie waited. She had learned, over these weeks, that the most important thing she could offer Brunhild was not an opening and not a prompt, but simply the presence of someone who would still be there when she was ready. Brunhild looked up. "They prayed for us," she said. Her voice was level. It did not shake, it did not crack, it did not perform the weight it was carrying. It simply carried it. Not for their soldiers, not for their country, for the people on the other side of this war. For us. She paused. For the children who come after. That they would not inherit the hatred. Sophie said nothing. "The man who led the prayer," Brunhild said. He said, "Let them start from something better than we did." The common room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, an owl called once and was silent. "What did you think?" Sophie asked carefully, "when you heard it?" Brunhild looked at the table. She was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of someone refusing to answer, but the silence of someone answering slowly and needing to get it right. "I thought," she said at last, "that no one ever taught me to do that. To pray for the enemy and mean it." She pressed her lips together. "We were taught to be certain, to know who was right and who was wrong, and to stay on the right side of the line. Faith was something you pointed at the other side." She stopped. That man was not pointing at anyone. Sophie said, "Earl said something today. He said his son would have sat down with anyone. He wrote home about a German family he saw on a road. He said they looked the same as anyone who had lost everything." Brunhild looked up sharply. "An American soldier," Sophie said. "In his letters home." Brunhild held her eyes for a moment and then looked away at the wall. "Do you think they always meant it?" she asked. Her voice was quiet and stripped of the architecture of argument that had always held it up before. It was just the question, standing in the open, without its armor. The kindness. The prayer. The food. The man who fixed the fence on his own time. Do you think they meant it? Or is it simply the shape of a culture that makes it look like meaning? Sophie looked at her. "I think some of them mean it the way Earl means it," she said. "Because they lost something and chose not to let the loss make them smaller." She paused. "And I think some of them mean it because they were raised in a place that taught them, from the beginning, that the person in front of you deserves what you have to offer." She folded her hands. "Either way, Brunhild, either way, it is more than we were taught." Brunhild did not answer, but she did not look away. Outside, the stars continued their indifferent and magnificent work above the small camp and the small town and the intact storefronts and the open-doored church and all the ordinary Americans inside their ordinary houses who did not know that two German women were sitting in a wooden room looking at something the world had placed in front of them and trying, honestly, to see it for what it was. The owl called again, further away this time, moving on. Brunhild unfolded her hands from the table and sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a long moment, and then she said one more thing, quietly, to no one in particular. "I don't know what to do with this." And Sophie, who did not have an answer for that, said only, "Neither do I. Not yet." Which was, between the two of them, the most honest thing that had been said in 3 weeks. The notice came on a Tuesday. A single sheet of paper, passed through the interpreter, delivered to each woman in turn, without ceremony. Repatriation processing would begin at the end of the week. Arrangements had been made. They would be returning to Germany. Sophie read the paper twice and folded it along its original crease, and placed it in her coat pocket beside the slip that had first sent her to the church kitchen, the one that said "Ask for Earl." She had kept that slip without deciding to. It had simply remained there, and she had not removed it. She told Earl the following morning. He was at the counter with his ledger when she came in, and she stood at her station for a moment before she said it, because the kitchen looked exactly as it always had. Clara at the breadboard, Margaret by the stove, Ruth checking the supply shelf, and she was aware, with the particular sharpness that endings bring, that she was seeing it as it was rather than as it had become familiar, which is not the same thing. "We leave Friday," she said. Earl set down his pencil. He looked at her with the steady attention he had given her from the first day, the kind that did not require a response to justify itself. "You ready?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. He nodded once, as though that were the correct answer. "Good," he said. People who are ready to leave usually haven't been paying attention. He reached beneath the counter and produced a small object. A folded piece of paper, thicker than writing paper, worn at the edges as though it had lived in a pocket for a long time before this. He held it out. She took it. She unfolded it carefully. Inside, in handwriting she did not recognize, younger than Earl's, looser, with the forward-leaning urgency of someone writing quickly and meaning every word, was a single sentence. The measure of a man is what he does when no one is watching. She looked up. Robert wrote that, Earl said, in a letter home. 1942, before he shipped out. He paused. I've had it in my pocket since we got the telegram. Figured it was time it went somewhere useful. Sophie held the paper in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. The kitchen continued around her, the sounds of work, of water, of Clara humming something low and tuneless. All of it ordinary. All of it, she understood now, extraordinary in its ordinariness. I don't know how to thank you, she said. You already did, Earl said. He picked up his pencil and returned to the ledger. You paid attention. That's all I ever asked. She went to her station and began to work. It was the last morning she would spend in this kitchen, and she worked it the same as every other. The full portions, the sealed bags, the names on the list given the careful attention they deserved. She did not work more slowly to extend it. She did not allow sentiment to alter the rhythm. She simply did the work as it was meant to be done, which was the only real tribute she had available. When the afternoon ended and she put on her coat, Earl was near the door with his hat in his hand. He did not make it into a speech. He looked at her and said, Take care of yourself, Sophie. You as well, she said. She walked out into the late afternoon light. On Friday morning, the truck came at 8. The women assembled outside the camp building with their small bags. The sky was high and pale, the kind of sky that makes distances feel truthful. A few of the camp staff stood near the truck, not in formation, not ceremonially, simply present in the way that people are present when something is ending and no one is entirely sure what expression to wear. Sophie and Brunhild stood side by side. Brunhild had said very little since Tuesday. Not the charged silence of the early weeks, not the coiled, argumentative quiet of someone preparing a position. Something softer. The silence of someone who has set something down and has not yet decided what to pick up next. The guard who had been on duty their first morning, the young one with the sunburned forearms and the clipboard, came past to check the group off his list. He glanced at Sophie and gave the small nod she had come to understand as simply, I see you. She nodded back. The bags were loaded. The women climbed in. The canvas flap was pulled across and the light narrowed to a thin line along the bottom edge, and the truck engine turned over and caught, and they were moving. Sophie felt the familiar vibration of the road through the metal wall at her back. Brunhild sat across from her, hands in her lap, looking at the floor. Then she looked up. Do you think they always meant it? She asked. It was the same question she had asked at the common room table the night after the chapel. But it arrived differently now. Not desperate, not rhetorical. Genuine. The question of someone who has passed through something and wants, before she moves on, to say what she actually thinks. Sophie considered it fully before answering. I think Earl meant it, she said. Every day, without an audience, for 3 years. I think Thomas meant it when he bowed his head over a bowl of soup. She paused. I think the man on the chapel steps meant it when he prayed for people he had every reason to hate. She looked at Brunhild steadily. I think that is enough. Not all of them. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to know what it looks like when it is real. Brunhild held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the canvas wall. Yes, she said quietly. I think so too. The truck moved on through the town. Through the narrow gap at the bottom of the canvas flap, Sophie caught a last glimpse of the main street passing beneath them, the edge of a sidewalk, the base of a storefront window, the corner of the church steps, white in the morning light. Then the road changed beneath the tires and the town was behind them. Brunhild did not look back. But for a long time, in the low hum of the engine and the steady motion of the road, her hands rested open in her lap, not clenched, not braced, simply open, and that, in its small and quiet way, was everything. Years later, in a schoolroom in Munich, a teacher would pause in the middle of a history lesson and set down her chalk. The children would look up, wondering. She would stand at the window for a moment, looking at something they could not see. Then she would turn back and say, There is a difference between what you are told about the world and what the world actually is. Your entire life will be spent learning that difference. Do not be afraid of the learning. She would not tell them where that thought came from, but she would fold a worn piece of paper back into her coat pocket and continue the lesson, and the children would write. And outside the window, the ordinary world would go on being more complicated and more full of grace than any single story about it could hold.